Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation to address this conference and to speak with you today. I'm an academic, so I'm not here to represent the European Union or the European Commission. But what I'd like to do is to give you an overview of some of the developments in European agricultural policy in the recent period, particularly the greater emphasis now being put on sustainability and how this is likely to affect exporting countries such as South Africa, for whom the European Union is an important agricultural export market. Let me just emphasize, first of all, that the sustainability agenda in EU agriculture covers all three pillars of sustainability, so environmental, economic, and social. The environmental agenda is partly to reduce the environmental footprint of farming and also the food system more generally, for example, by reducing net greenhouse gas emissions, improving air quality through reducing ammonia emissions, reducing water use abstraction and improving the quality of water, reversing the decline in biodiversity, improving soil health, and in general, reducing the use of external inputs through a more circular bioeconomy. But also to promote the production of public goods. So, for example, paying farmers to create habitats for biodiversity, to store carbon in their soils and in vegetation, and to improve landscape and amenity more generally. Those are the environmental aspects of sustainability, but there are, as I say, also economic aspects, including income for farmers, helping farmers to manage risk, particularly important given the climate extremes that we're now observing, improving productivity, and improving the bargaining power of farmers in the food chain. And then a range of social issues. So, for example, concern over the number of farms, the size and ownership of farms, the issue of generational renewal, encouraging more younger farmers to enter the industry, improving animal welfare, the One Health agenda, and more generally improving and strengthening the vitality of rural areas. Specifically, with respect to agriculture, the Green Deal is reflected in what we call the farm to fork strategy. So, this was a strategy set out by the Commission, which contained a number of quantitative targets. And I've set these out here just to set the context. With respect to climate, the objective is that the agriculture and land use sector, so the AFLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, would achieve net carbon neutrality by 2035, and thereafter would actually ensure negative emissions, carbon removals, which would offset some of the unavoidable emissions from other sectors of the economy. In terms of chemical use, the farm to fork objective is to reduce nutrient losses by 50% and to the use of chemical fertilizers by at least 20% by 2030, and also to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%. Although I have to admit, these percentage reductions are against a baseline which is somewhat unclear. Another objective is to increase the area under organic farming from around 8% at the current time to around 25% by 2030. In terms of health, the objective is to reduce the use of antimicrobials, particularly in animal husbandry, by 50% by 2030. In terms of biodiversity, the objective is to ensure that 10% of agricultural land will be devoted to non-productive features by 2030. So these would be landscape features like small areas of woodland, hedgerows, areas of scrub land, marginal land, which are not particularly valuable for agricultural production, but which can be really important as habitat for biodiversity. And finally, there are objectives around animal welfare, a commitment to introduce improved labeling, to encourage consumers to look for better animal welfare products, the transport of animals, increased space, and importantly, a prohibition on the use of cages for certain species, which the Commission has committed to introducing legislation for in the very near future. So now let's look at some of the potential impacts of these Green Deal measures for European agriculture, because this is where the linked market opportunities for exporting countries such as South Africa comes in. And there have been a number of empirical studies which have attempted to model what will be the impact on EU production if indeed these ambitious targets set out in the Farm to Fork strategy were to be achieved. And this table here summarizes some of the findings of these empirical studies. They're, of course, based on models and assumptions that lie behind these models. But I think the basic message is plausible and clear. Essentially, if we achieve the reduction in chemical nitrogen use, in pesticide use, if we set aside further land for nature, if we extensify production by increasing the area under organic farming, all of this is expected to lead to reduced production within the European Union. And you can see the specific numbers differ across the studies, but in general, the arrows all point in the same direction. So we expect overall reduced production in the European Union. Of course, as I've mentioned, it's not only on the production side. The Farm to Fork strategy also seeks to bring about a change in consumer behavior. And I've just a couple of slides here taken from a recent study which looks at the potential impact on the demand side if European consumers were to move in the direction of the well-known Eat Lancet diet. Now, I want to emphasize that this is in itself not a specific objective of the Farm to Fork strategy. It's not the objective that we should follow the Eat Lancet diet in detail. As many of you will know, this is quite a controversial diet, but it's illustrates the direction in which Europe would like to go. So reduced consumption of animal products and increased consumption, particularly of fruits, vegetables, and nuts. So what you see here are results from two different models, basically looking at three scenarios. So a reference scenario to 2030 and to 2050. And then a scenario called Scenario 10, which would lead to a 10% movement from, if you like, the baseline or the reference scenario towards a diet which is the same as the Eat Lancet diet. So a 10% movement, that's the first scenario, a 30% movement, and then on the final column on the right-hand side, what would happen if we were actually to achieve the full Eat Lancet diet in the European Union. And you can see the numbers are really quite striking, particularly the reductions observed for meat products, and particularly red meat, beef, but also the expected increase in consumption of fruits and vegetables. So basically, that's the pattern that we would expect to see, even if, as I say, the end result is not necessarily to bring about the Eat Lancet diet in totality. Looking then at the implications, if we were to achieve those kind of dietary changes in Europe, what would be the implications for trade? So this is ignoring any of the production changes that we've already highlighted. And you can see that, again, the three scenarios are emphasized across the top. You can see both imports and export trends for each scenario. And if you just focus on the imports, you can see again, depending on the scenario, that we would expect to see a drop in the import of meat products, particularly beef, into the European Union, given the dietary changes that are simulated here. But we would expect to see a significant increase in imports, particularly of fruits and vegetables. Indeed, if we were to bring about the full Eat Lancet diet, which of course has very limited animal products, it would imply, according to this study, around an 11 times increase in imports of fruits and vegetables. So let me just try to summarize the story so far. So when we look at the implementation of the Green Deal targets in European agriculture, the first round effects will be to increase demand for exports from third countries, including South Africa, partly because compliance with higher EU sustainability standards will lower EU production and increase imports, but also because the proposed dietary shifts towards greater fruit, vegetable, and nut consumption will also contribute to this increase in imports. Of course, there will be more general effects other than the direct impacts for exporting countries, in that lower EU production will contribute to higher global food prices, with potential negative impacts, of course, on food importing developing countries, while food exporting countries would expect to benefit. Of course, increased EU imports may lead to environmental degradation or the shift of pollution to countries where that increase in production is going to take place. It may also exacerbate social concerns in exporting countries. So there may well be a second round set of impacts arising from accompanying trade policy measures, which will then act as a form of non-tariff barrier, which would offset some of those first round effects that we have discussed. So let me now turn to look at what the European Union is proposing in terms of the trade policy measures that would accompany the Green Deal. Let's look first at the objectives of these trade policy measures. So partly to safeguard EU production capacity by ensuring that EU producers compete with imports on a level playing field. And of course, linked to that, to limit opposition to raising domestic sustainability standards and to head off calls for lower standards from an important producer group. So that's the, if you like, the protectionist motive, but there is also a sustainability motive. So to avoid the offshoring of the negative environmental consequences of EU consumption through existing or increased imports. So for example, if in the European Union, farmers are required to undertake measures that would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and if that raises their costs and results in lower production, if that production is simply replaced by imports from third countries, then of course those emissions will simply be transferred abroad. And from the point of view of the global climate, there is not necessarily any gain to be achieved. And thirdly, an objective of these trade policy measures is to raise global sustainability standards by leveraging access to the EU market to give a stimulus to exporting countries to also raise their standards in turn. If we look at the initiatives that the European Union has proposed in this area of the external dimension of the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, there's a wide range of measures. And these were signaled first in an important trade policy strategy document published by the European Commission in February of last year. This review called for a more assertive, yet open, but sustainable trade policy. So, an important pillar of the policy is the emphasis on safe, secure, and sustainable supply chains. And as part of that, the Commission flagged that it would be looking to require imports to meet similar sustainability standards as those required of EU producers. This emphasis was reflected also in the CAP political agreement that I've mentioned already in July of last year. There was indeed an amendment from the European Parliament in those negotiations, which would have inserted into the basic legislation that imports should meet the same sustainability standards as European producers. In the end, that amendment was not accepted, but it was agreed that the Commission would bring forward a report, which is now available, was published in June of this year, looking at both the legal but also the operational feasibility of introducing such reciprocity standards on imports. As part of the declarations attached to that political agreement, the Commission accepted or committed to undertake a review of pesticide import tolerances, and that's an issue I'm going to come back to in just a moment. But first, let me just indicate some of the other initiatives that the Commission has proposed. For example, a proposed regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, published in November of last year. Again, I'll come back to talk about that in just a moment. For industrial products, there is a proposal to introduce a so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this would reflect the fact that industrial products within the European Union face a carbon tax through the emissions trading scheme that is operated. And the intention is that imports of initially a limited number of industrial products would also be required to pay a similar charge to European producers. Already there has been introduced in what's called the veterinary medicines regulation an antibiotics mirror clause. So this basically extends or requires imports of meat products to meet with a number of the standards that European Union producers must obey. The two issues here are, first of all, a ban on the import of meat products that have been produced using antibiotics as growth promoters. So if a country is accepting the use of antibiotics, as I say, as a method of promoting growth in animals, that meat will no longer be acceptable on the European market. Furthermore, the European Union is proposing that a limited set of antibiotics, which are deemed to be really important for human use, should be reserved for human use. And again, if those are used in animal husbandry in an exporting country, the European Union will not allow such meat to be introduced into the European market. That mirror clause is currently in force in the legislation, but hasn't actually been implemented yet because it's still depending on a set of delegated acts to actually bring it into force. There's a proposal for a sustainable corporate due diligence directive, which would oblige particularly larger companies to assess the risk of environmental and social harm in their supply chains and to take steps to mitigate those risks. There is a review of trade and sustainable development chapters in the European Union's free trade agreements. I've already talked about the review of animal welfare legislation and the proposal for this regulation on sustainable food systems at the end of next year. I want to just take up two of these legislative initiatives in more detail. And the first is with respect to so-called mirror clauses. Let me talk a little bit in more detail about one of those important initiatives, which is the introduction of mirror clauses. An early example is the ban on imports of hormone-treated beef. I've just talked about the ban on meat treated with certain types of antibiotics. But let me refer to what the Commission is proposing with regard to changes in maximum residue limits for pesticides, and linked to that, import tolerances. And there are three issues that are under discussion. The first is the Commission has committed to a review of maximum residue limits for active substances that are banned in the EU because of the hazard based criteria in the pesticides regulation. So basically, this refers to active substances that are deemed to be carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic, basically for reproductive purposes, and which are simply not allowed in the European Union. And regardless of whether there's a risk assessment or not, the European Union is proposing to set the maximum residue limits for these products to zero. Also significant is it is committing to assess the environmental impacts when setting maximum residue limits for active substances that are banned in the EU. So currently, if a substance is banned for health reasons, then it's already the case that the MRL is set to zero. But until now, environmental impacts, which could be a basis for banning the use of the substance in the European Union, these environmental aspects have not been addressed when setting the MRLs. The Commission is proposing to change that, and indeed is already proposed a draft regulation with respect to two neonicotinoids, which are banned for outdoor use in the European Union because of the damage to bees and to pollinators more generally. And these would now the current MRLs follow in a number of cases the Codex standards, so they are not set to zero. And the Commission is proposing to do that. So basically, there would be a zero tolerance for pesticide, for residues of these two neonicotinoids on imported products. Now, the Commission is saying that import tolerances could still be set on a case by case basis if the applicant provides scientific evidence that the use of these neonicotinoids does not adversely impact pollinators in the exporting country. But this would be something that would have to be established. It would not be automatic. Note that there is some demand within the European Union that even this case by case opt out would not be allowed. That if indeed a substance is banned in the European Union, products that have been produced with the aid of that substance in the exporting country would also be prohibited. But that's not what the Commission is proposing at the present time. It is allowing for this let out in terms of import tolerances. Another important initiative, although I suspect less applicable to South Africa, is the mandatory due diligence proposal for forest risk commodities. This will require operators to ensure that products such as soy, beef, palm oil, cocoa, coffee, and so on, that are placed on the EU market have not been produced on recently deforested land. As I say, I suspect this is not particularly relevant to South Africa, so I'll leave that to any questions that may come later. So, to summarize the key messages of my talk, we know that planet Earth is suffering, that food systems must meet the triple challenge of ensuring food security, providing livelihoods, while protecting health and the natural resource base on which future food production depends. As I've argued, the first round impacts of Green Deal policies will be to increase market opportunities for exporters, particularly for fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and where I think South Africa has real possibilities in the future. But there will be these indirect impacts through the requirements to meet higher import standards. And these are clearly a non tariff measure that will raise trade costs, reduce trade, but potentially, of course, improve environmental outcomes both in Europe and abroad. Ideally, one would like to see multilateral agreements around these issues. They are the gold standard, but often we observe that they reflect the lowest common denominator and often lack effective enforcement provisions. And hence the move by the European Union to introduce these more autonomous or unilateral measures. Import standards, of course, suffer from the fact that they are one size fits all. They don't account for differences between exporting countries. But it's clear the EU can be pressed over, for example, the length of transition periods that it allows and the extent of financial assistance that it is willing to provide to low income producers. Let me stop at this point, and I look forward to any questions that may come subsequently in the discussion. Thank you for your attention.